Professor Thompson suggested that I speak on the cosmological dimension of the ecological crisis. By cosmological, of course, I do not mean the modern abstraction taken from various physical sciences which are called cosmology, such problems as are discussed by Professor Bundy and the Cambridge cosmologists and the like. That is not cosmology at all in the sense which I am using the term. The modern world does not have a cosmology. Cosmology is the application of metaphysics to the domain of the cosmos, and is not an application of the sciences based upon empiricism and observation and ratiocination, which are then put together in a kind of abstract total system which changes almost as rapidly as the wind. So one day the universe is expanding, then it's contracting, then it's finite, then it's infinite. All you have, if you just don't like it, you have to wait a few weeks until somebody else comes up with a new theory. That is not cosmology, as I'm using the term. So here cosmology could always be interchanged with applied metaphysics, that is the metaphysical dimensions of the ecological crisis about which I wish to speak. As Professor Thompson just said, almost everyone who has been speaking about the ecological crisis during the last decade or so has concentrated on such problems as overpopulation, lack of resources, and so forth and so on, hoping that through a few programs of an economic or technological kind, the disasters which the misapplication of modern science have brought upon the natural environment can be averted, and man can go on happily for a long time to come in the state of the forgetfulness of God. But that will not happen. That will not happen at all, and the ecological crisis is not a passing and transient phase in the ever greater development of the powers of modern man within the world of nature and his domination of nature. I believe that the ecological crisis is a kind of external manifestation of a very deep inward disease, which oftentimes, like certain diseases, does not manifest an outward sign until a very late stage in its growth. And it implies, for that reason, very deep transformations and changes that must come about within the soul of man, and especially Western man, who first took the great plunge of creating a civilization based upon the forgetting of the spiritual world. Civilization which after 4 centuries of resistance by Asia and Africa was finally accepted in these worlds also, and now has become, in a sense, global. Not in a complete sense, but relatively speaking, and which at least has spilled over into the other continents, into its big cities, if not into its villages and towns. Now, to understand this dimension of the ecological crisis, which is very rarely mentioned, I must take a little historical detour. I was perhaps the first person in this country to have spoken of the historical roots of the ecological crisis, which later became the title of a famous paper by Lynn White, delivered to the American Academy of Science in 1967. Year after I delivered the Rockefeller Series lectures at the University of Chicago on the exact same theme. It's not important who said what first, the important thing is what has been said. And it is to this that I want to turn for a few minutes. The so-called ecological crisis has become a conscious factor in the lives of Western men and women only since the 60s. In fact, it's only a decade old. If we're speaking in New York in 1963 or 4, even in this big city, this would not have been a subject that would have attracted a great deal of attention. Then suddenly the thing came upon us. And in a characteristic fashion of what goes on in the world today, like the energy crisis which soon followed and which no one spoke about before, the deeper roots, the deeper causes were never seen, and suddenly once an external effect was shown, then people began to search for the deeper causes involved. But what is it that is really involved in the ecological crisis? It is a way that a certain part of humanity has conceived for some time to come of the meaning of force, of matter, of substance, of time, and of space, and of man's relation to this complex energy material, you might say, totality or ambiance, which he calls the natural world. Now, it was not so easy for such a transformation to take place that a part of humanity suddenly decided that this whole natural domain was an it to be explored, dissected, divided, and used without any rights of its own. It has a very long history. Why is it that this did not happen elsewhere? Why was it that in the 13th century, which was the highlight of the European Middle Ages, the people who were doing the most advanced mathematics, if I can use this term from the point of view of the history of mathematics in its modern sense, were not living in England or France, they were living in Khorasan. And a person like Khaja Nasr Tusi, the famous Persian mathematician, was developing the science of trigonometry as an independent discipline, in a place very far away from where later on Descartes and Pascal were to give birth to modern mathematics. The same goes true for physics, for astronomy, for what later on came to be known as chemistry, and the like. If you were to look at the history of various civilizations of the world, you would see that as far back as the 13th and 14th centuries, there were other parts of the world where the most so-called advanced work, I keep using this in quotation marks because it's a relative term, was being done in those very disciplines which later on were to become the core of Western science. But why was it that that jump was never taken in a civilization such as that of Islam or of China or India, certainly in these three great civilizations of Asia, which had the power for abstract thought and very strict logical language and power of analysis and all that is needed from an intellectual point of view to develop the kind of science that was developed in the West. Of course, historians of science can always point to a certain kind of continuity, saying that, well, yes, look at these formulas that were developed. Let's say the famous Pascal binomial theorem is now shown to have been discovered by Khayyam, by the famous Persian poet and mathematician, and certain concepts were discovered by Aryabhata in India, and so forth and so on. They would try to point to continuity in the history of science, but that is really a very, very superficial way of looking at the history of science. If you want to somebody open the door, please do so. It's much better than having this bell ring. I think this was for raising the dead after as day of judgment. It's a rather superficial way of looking at the whole situation. It is like pointing to a kind of material continuity between, let us say, the Greece of Sophocles and the Greece of St. Gregory of Palamas. They're both Greece, they both use stones for their buildings and churches and temples, but the spiritual ambiance is quite something else. They're two different worlds. One produces a Venus and the other one the icon of the Virgin Mary, which are very different. It's in the same way that if we do not look more profoundly, we will see a superficial continuity from one phase to another. It's not at all what happened. What happened was that in these civilizations, where certain techniques in mathematics, in surgery, in medicine, in pharmacology, in astronomy, and so on were developed, certain abstract ideas were developed, extremely complicated mathematical physics was developed, which even now, if you want to study, we have to have at least a college degree in mathematics, otherwise we can't understand it. The universe was not divorced from its sacred character. No one ever thought that man, qua man, had the right of dissecting the universe and doing with it what wanted, and no one ever considered it possible or legitimate to separate the knowledge of this world from a higher form of knowledge. That is, the hierarchy of knowledge was never destroyed. And there was never an attempt made, no matter how advanced these mathematicians or physicists or physicians became in their work, and some of it is as good science in the modern sense as the work done by Heisenberg or Hertz or Maxwell or anybody else, they never destroyed the hierarchy of knowledge. Now what happened in the West in the 17th century is not just a quantitative jump from, let's say, writing 20 books on mathematics a year compared to a population of n numbers to suddenly 100. It's not at all a quantitative jump. It is actually a very profound change in the conception of man and of his role in the universe. It's true that the scientific revolution in the West took place in the 17th century. That's true. But the more profound revolution in the concept of the meaning of human existence took place in the Renaissance. It's very important to note that the Renaissance did not produce modern science. It is true that people talk about Leonardo da Vinci and Copernicus who lived in the Renaissance, but they didn't produce modern science. The major change of attitude really comes in the 17th century. It comes with the discourses of Galileo and all that took place really in the early decades of the 17th century. Renaissance science is really still an esoteric, medieval, sacred science cut from its metaphysical roots and therefore floating on the surface as occult science. It is not accidental that so many books appear on Hermetic science in the Renaissance. It isn't that these sciences were developed at that time. It is, in fact, much more difficult to explain. The reason is that the roots were cut. It is like if you take a water lily, a plant that gives these beautiful flowers, and cut its roots, suddenly the whole thing comes to the surface, and you think you have a lot of water lilies. But actually what you're seeing is the death of that plant. This is precisely what happened in the Renaissance. What people like Pico and Ficino and others were writing about was not that there was suddenly a flowering of this kind of science. No. In fact, what we're witnessing at that time is a death of the metaphysical roots. It is the death of a kind of knowledge which had made possible the flowering of such sciences within the bosom of a total sacred Christian civilization. And once that science, that what we can call the Scientia Sacra, the sacred science, the gnosis, the metaphysical knowledge, became dimmed, if let's not say completely forgotten, anyway, removed from the mainstream of Christian intellectual thought, once this occurred, these sciences came floating into the surface, as I said. A lot of books were written, but the science itself did not change until a century later, when a completely new form of science, which considered all of this to be sheer nonsense, suddenly came upon the stage, and we were faced with modern chemistry, modern physics, and so forth and so on, modern astronomy, certain sciences such as biology and medicine developing somewhat later. Now, what made possible this remarkable change, which in fact was received an impetus by the fact that there were two other important elements involved. First of all, European man was able to capture the earth. And that also has something directly to do with his own new conception of himself, in the sense that he put human activity beyond the pale of any religious consideration. That is, you could make cannons and shoot, whereas the Chinese also had gunpowder but didn't make any cannons. That is, everything was fair play in that sense. This conquest of the earth on the one hand, and the amassing of wealth that came with it, were added to this very profound, more philosophical transformation that was coming about. And the result of it was that you attained a new type of vision of man who thought, primo, first of all, that he was completely independent of both heaven and earth. As he was able to revolt against heaven in a very profound sense. It's not true that everyone didn't revolt against heaven. There's always very few who do. The masses, until 10 years ago, were all very devout and religious. It's the thinking minds that guide society. I'm talking about them. First of all, a kind of independence, as I said, from both heaven and earth. From heaven in the sense that man did not really feel himself bound to heaven in the same way that he had when the West had a total religious tradition, in which every form of knowledge had to be related to the sacred in one way or another. Secondly, free from the earth in the sense that Western man felt that he had a mobility which enabled him to move about wherever he wanted to go and to do with the earth whatever he wished to do. To this was added a very remarkable philosophical, you might say, transformation, and that is that Western man began to seek for the infinite within the finite order, which then began to appear as having infinite possibilities. Now, in all civilizations, the quest for the infinite lay at the heart of these civilizations. The reason for it being very simple, and that is that a definition of man is a being who always must transcend himself. That's one of the definitions you can give of man. A creature which is never satisfied with what it is, which always wishes to transcend itself. If the transcend is understood in a correct sense, it's a vertical ascent. Otherwise, he follows the echo, the shadow of this transcendence in his earthly and worldly activities. The idea of satisfaction, which is one of the highest spiritual stations in Sufism, is never attainable by any form of activity which man performs, except the spiritual activity. But it is the goal of all human activity. Look at all these people acting from morning to night on Fifth Avenue. What are they doing? They're trying to satisfy what they feel are certain needs. Ambition, money, passion, whatever it is. But they're never satisfied. But the reason is that it is within the nature of man to always want to go beyond where he is. And that's what I meant by transcend. And in all traditions, this urge was turned in a vertical sense or in an interior sense. They're both the same, the vertical dimension and the inner dimension being alike. And the infinite was put at the level of the infinite. That is, in all traditions it was taught, only the infinite is infinite, which seems to be a tautology and a very plain truth to understand. But what happened in the Renaissance is that the quest for the infinite was transferred from the infinite, that is, from the vertical dimension leading to the transcendent and the beyond, back to the earth. One of his first echoes was that the echo of infinity in art was removed from Christian art, because all art, all beautiful art, has an element of perfection and an element of infinity or mystery. I shall be discussing that in the lectures I'm giving on the philosophy of Islamic art on my last lecture on Thursday. But I cannot take the time to go into this now because this is really incidental to our discussion. But one mystery in art, especially in sacred art, always is related to the sense of the infinite, as perfection is related to the sense of the absolute. And God is at once absolute and infinite in every metaphysics. Now, one of the first things that appeared in the Renaissance is that the element of mystery was removed. And Renaissance art became an anthropomorphic art. I mean the main Renaissance art, the people who consider to be the great gods of art, like Michelangelo. There is no mystery in Michelangelo. It's the Titanic. It is essentially the revolt against heaven. The David of Michelangelo is heavy, it's titanic, but there's not the sense of mystery as you find, let's say, in medieval paintings, or in Chartres, or in icons of the Eastern Church, even up to our own times, Russian icons. So you have the sense of the infinite removed from the religious consciousness to a large extent and transferred to another domain. That is, this quest for the infinite becomes an earthly quest. And the earth appears to have infinite possibilities. There's a lot of land, there are the Americas, there's India, there's Asia, there's Australia, and Western man suddenly loses the consciousness of the limited nature of terrestrial existence, which perhaps no other civilization had ever sensed before. And it was the divine kindness that permitted this. If you have 10 years of drought like you had last summer in England, the whole conception of Western man vis-a-vis the earth would change. It was only in Western Europe that nature was kind enough to allow even the peasantry to forget the drudgery of making a living to a large extent. And when this was added to all the wealth that poured in from, as I said, the Americas and Asia and Africa and so forth and so on, the idea that the earthly domain, that the physical domain is limited in possibility, somehow was lost as a concrete reality, as a concrete part of life. Whereas in all these millennia, in all of the civilizations, the Chinese, the Islamic, the Hindu, the ancient Persian, everybody realized that the world was limited. Its possibilities were limited. And therefore none of these civilizations tried to fulfill the need of man for the infinite in the finite world. The ecological crisis is the result of seeking infinite possibilities within a finite world. That is really what it is in a metaphysical sense. But as to why this happened, why did this happen in the Renaissance, in especially Southern Europe, and later on was extended to Northern Europe, I think the reason is this. Whatever happens in a great civilization is due either to the positive aspects of the spiritual norm dominating over that civilization, or the negative aspects when that norm weakens. Now, the grandeur and beauty of Christianity is, of course, the presentation of divine mysteries, which is present in Christian theology, it's present in its art, and so forth and so on, and which produced this remarkably beautiful civilization. But there was a kind of point of forgetting, not that it was a limitation, but once Christianity became weakened, it became a limitation. And that is the sacred character of nature, which also had a great deal to do with the heritage of the Mediterranean people, that is the Christian Mediterranean people. The Northern Europeans, before their Christianization, had all possessed religions in which nature played a very important role. We all know that for a long time the Germanic people refused to move out of wooden houses into stone ones, which is a very telling thing. That is, we're still too close to nature to accept an excessively heavy, solidified ambiance. And we see, after Christianity comes to Europe, that it is only among a few Celtic and Germanic monks in which you have these remarkably beautiful poems and hymns to nature as a positive theophany of God. In the Mediterranean world, Christianity had to overcome a terrible, what we might call, worship of the cosmos, cosmic idolatry, if I can call it that. I don't want to create a new word, cosmolatry, that some people have done. Anyway, idolatry of the cosmos, which was a kind of weakening of the Greek religion itself. That is, this kind of secularization of the cosmos in late Greek philosophy is the result of the weakening of the Olympian religions in Greece, as the late Francis Cornforth has shown so beautifully. But this Christianity had to overcome. And therefore, it chose between a correct theology and a weak vision of the cosmos, and a sacred vision of the cosmos and a false theology. It chose the first option, and correctly. And the early church fathers of the Latin, those especially with the Latin mentality, in a sense chided away from discussing what later theologians sometimes call the cosmic Christ. That is, the cosmic function of the Christic message and the role that the universe can have in a positive sense in spiritual realization. This is, for example, seen in the medieval miniatures, these beautiful illuminated miniatures, in which the forests are always dark, which what is light is the city, and the city is always crystalline. And the miniatures of the celestial Jerusalem, which is the re-establishment of heaven and earth, is always a crystalline vision. There are no trees in it, and there are no animals. And this was relegated to the background, of course not completely, because this is spiritual reality, and it remained among, especially the Nordic people, the northern people of Europeans, it remained always as a kind of nostalgia. And also among certain great saints, among the Latins, like St. Francis of Assisi, it became a concrete possibility. There would have been no ecological crisis if the type of spirituality of St. Francis had continued, if people could still speak to the sun. But this was just a possibility that somehow came to an end And therefore, this necessity within the spread of Christianity in the Occident, because things are very different among the Coptics and Eastern churches who didn't have this problem exactly, but it spread at the very heartland of the Romano-Greco-Roman civilization, brought with it the possibility of a certain negative attitude towards the natural order, which was perfectly all right and a part of a normal civilization as long as Christianity was strong. But it happened that at the very time when this civilization was to receive its full flowering, in a sense it was murdered by the revival of Greek paganism, if I can put it in these very strong terms. Not the Greece of Pythagoras or Plato, but the Greece which died of its own excessive anthropomorphic philosophy and art, a Greece in which the mysteries had already become totally anthropomorphized, and which Plato himself criticized in his laws. Plato criticized the art of his own day, 5th century, 4th century BC, as being already decadent art. He went back to the art of the Homeric age, the geometric, non-anthropomorphic art of a period when Greek religion was alive. So when I say the murder of Christian civilization by Greek paganism, I don't mean, of course, Pythagoras. Pythagoras was not a pagan, he was a very great prophet. I shall come to him in a moment. I'm talking about this kind of sophistic way of thinking, which is very significant because today modern man would accept to go to hell and be sophisticated, but not to go to heaven and be simple. To be sophisticated is such a great virtue, because precisely of this revival of paganism after over a millennium of the flowering of a Christian civilization. But this weakening of the heart of the Christian tradition, fortunately, of course, not its destruction, but the totality became weakened. And it's first seen, actually, by the anathema cast against the type of spirituality which Meister Eckhart and men like him represent within Christianity. This made possible this negative aspect, this lack of interest in nature, to suddenly appear to the Renaissance man as being a kind of a lost paradise that has to be recovered. And therefore nature became to a large extent a kind of domain to be rediscovered, a thing of beauty that was forgotten, but rediscovered no longer within Christianity. That was the great tragedy of it. That is, the Renaissance painters, for example, felt, oh, how wonderful to be able to paint a tree or a bird or something like that. And they painted some very beautiful countryside or, let's say, painting of the countryside, which from a purely human point of view is beautiful, but it's not a Sung painting. It is not an echo any longer of the archetypal world. It is not the paradise that is reflected on the lower waters. It just happens to be a copy of nature. And therefore, Western study of nature went along a line which made the study of nature of ever greater attraction, which began to attract the greatest minds in Western Europe, both scientific, philosophical minds, and also those who were interested in art, and created essentially through their art. And the great results came out of this. But the whole study was turned in a direction away from the total Christian tradition and point of view. And it was as a result of this revolt, essentially, of Western man against his image of being a half-angel, half-man figure, his loss of paradise, which made possible the discovery of a new earth. It is not my saying, but that of Friedrich Schwann in his remarkable book, Regards sur le monde ancien, concerning ancient worlds, which he says every time man loses a heaven, a new earth opens before him. But an earth which lies on the lower level of being. There's never in human history a loss from above which is not compensated by gain from below. And that's why there is the loss from above. And that is what theologically is explained by the cleverness of the devil. It is always when you give up something sacred that you immediately gain something wonderful but worldly. Otherwise you will never give up the sacred. And that is why the movement without the help of God is always in a fall. That's why you have gravity and grace. In fact, that's why there's gravity in things. It is the element, the tamasic element, as the Hindus would say, which lies in our whole state of separation from the source. And that is why the whole of the spiritual life is to change this inclination so that we can soar like eagles. You've seen these birds that fly and suddenly they go like that, and without having to move their wing, they move upward. That is because there is within the vein of the universe a kind of upward tendency. And we have to discover that to be able to fly upwards. But until we haven't done that, we always fall. And therefore there appeared to the man of the Renaissance in the 17th century that there was a great discovery that is made. A new earth has been discovered, yes. But as I said, a discovery which was at the expense of the loss of a particular heaven. A heaven which no longer revealed itself to the vast majority of Western people, and the type of intellectuality and spirituality in which science and the sacred were combined was relegated to the margin. And so you have, from the 17th century onward, an official history of philosophy and official history of science, which is taught in Western schools. Montaigne, Descartes, Malebranche, Locke, Hume, Kant, and so forth and so on, in the philosophy field, and starting with Tycho Brahe and Kepler and Galileo and Newton and Boyle and so forth and so on, coming all the way down to our own physicists of today. There is, of course, a kind of marginal history which is of great interest, because man being man, that sacred vision in which science and the mysteries were combined, if I can put it like this, could not have disappeared completely. So you had on the margin, even within the soul of a single human being, such as Isaac Newton, the writing of the Principia Mathematica and the alchemical papers, which now, after 3 centuries, are finally being edited. It just goes to show how objective scholarship is by those who claim objectivity. There were at least 2,000 books on Isaac Newton as a physicist, but everyone was scared to touch the over 1 million words which Sir Isaac Newton wrote on alchemy and the cosmological sciences, and which lie at the Cambridge and Oxford University libraries, and which are now being edited finally for the first time, thanks to the changes that are taking place now, not in the official university circles, but among at least certain human beings in the West. So sometimes it took place within the soul of a single human being. Newton was both a physicist in the modern sense and an alchemist who could have sat down with Paracelsus and Jabir ibn Hayyan and had a good old discussion about transmutation. That is, he lived in 2 cosmoses, 2 worlds, 2 universes. And oftentimes, of course, there were different figures. People who moved on the side, essentially, as I said, of European intellectual history, even if they were very famous, like Goethe. Goethe was Germany's most famous literary figure. But his Naturphilosophia, his Farbenlehre, his works on color and so forth and so on, they were not in the mainstream of European thought and physics or of science. And oftentimes, of course, lesser known figures like Claude Saint-Martin and people like that, who are just known to a few people, specialists in the history of occultism or the esoteric in Europe. And so the things really parted ways. And gradually, as that total metaphysical knowledge, which always must be led to a way of realization, of a spiritual realization, was lost in the West, or it became less and less accessible. I mean, you have a few, for example, Christian Hermeticists even surviving today in Italy, but they're extremely hard to get in contact with. As the general mass of humanity in the West had no longer access to a religion in which there is spiritual discipline, in which methods of the control of the mind and the body are taught, along with general devotional rites. As this became more and more prevalent, the sacred sciences gradually turned into occultism. And I use here occultism in a negative sense, not in a positive sense. That is, as sciences whose principles are forgotten, and therefore they have really become occult. Occult in the sense of hidden in its exterior sense. Whereas these are all sciences of the strictest logical and inner consistency, and sciences which can be explained as easily as can chemistry from the foundations of a molecular philosophy of matter. And, but once the principles were forgotten, they really became hodgepodge, superstition, occult sciences in the pejorative sense of the word, and not in its positive sense. And it was in this kind of ambiance that late in the 19th century, a group of Europeans, feeling that they had no place to breathe. They couldn't breathe within the world of modern science. They couldn't breathe within the world of the established churches, either Catholic, Protestant, or even Judaism, whose Hasidic and Kabbalistic elements had become very, very difficult of access, began to sort of create religions of their own. And you began to get this wave of all kinds of occult religions, in a sense, connected with the name of Eliphas Levi in France, and especially France, the place which had been the home of the so-called Enlightenment, which is really the darkening of the human spirit, called the Enlightenment. Since Satan is the ape of God, satanic things always represent themselves in reverse. And in our world, there are many things which have a name exactly opposite to what they mean. And this is one of them, the Age of Enlightenment. In this country, a so-called Age of Enlightenment, this wave first began, but also the anthroposophy of Rudolf Steiner in Germany and places like that, all of them seeking for a kind of total sacred knowledge which would somehow embrace the natural order as well as the inner order. And this process, of course, is still going on under our own eyes, and it will not be accomplished until, I think, there is a complete revival of the Christian tradition in its totality, as well as a full appreciation and understanding of the great traditions of Asia, which still have preserved their totality. I shall come at the end to speak about this a few minutes, but let me come back to our own theme. Now, this background which caused this transformation within the soul of Western man, which somehow drew a kind of parallel between Christianity and other religions, Western Europe and the rest of the earth, which allowed, in fact, the earth to be looked upon in a different way. Once you were outside of your home, you had a very nice English garden in Upper England, but once you went to India, it didn't matter what you did, how many people you killed to attain what you wanted to attain. This kind of extraterritoriality of your own even ethical values, but contributed for several centuries to many remarkable things, including what happened in this country, which is one of the most interesting. Where we are standing right now, I don't mean Manhattan, but this continent, developed what was perhaps the most remarkable religion from the point of view of its relationship with nature. That is the religion, especially of the Plains Indians, the Sioux and people of that area, the nomadic American Indians, who became so closely attuned to the movements and rhythms of nature, not in a naturalistic pagan sense at all, but in a remarkably metaphysical sense, that they turned this whole continent into a cathedral. They didn't build any cathedrals, but they preserved this remarkably beautiful continent as a cathedral. For someone who comes from another continent, which has been lived on for a long time, whether it be Europe or Asia, the first experience of America is a kind of paradisal experience, especially if you go to the Teton Mountains or someplace like that, and you feel that somehow a primordial man has been living here. I mean, he's been able to preserve a part of nature as Adam probably saw it, as it came out of the hand of the Creator. And in this part of the world, it's remarkable how both the Southern Europeans, that is the Spaniards, and the Northern Europeans, that is the French and the English, who conquered this part of the world, were so indifferent to the theological and religious significance of the nature, that is the whole natural ambiance, which provided the background for the civilizations which lived here. That's one of the most remarkable episodes in human history, because the conquest of the Americas happened to coincide exactly with the moment when these profound changes were taking place within the mentality of Western Europeans, and except for a few people here and there who were exceptions, you could have the most devout Christians from Spain, which is always a very conserving and conservative part of Western European society. I'm not talking about England and Germany. From Spain, cutting down the whole forests and killing millions of animals without thinking that this might have any religious effect upon the person himself or upon what he's doing, because they were acting in really pure intention and with good intention. They were very honest men. They were not being hypocritical because they weren't conscious of what was happening. And therefore, the case of America is a very good example of what happened And that is why I think the ecological crisis began, first of all, in America. The contrast between the Teton Mountains and the coal mines in Pennsylvania are just too great not to bother the conscience of people who suddenly become compressed by a society which they have themselves created. Anyway, this plundering of Europe, by Europe, of, first of all, the Americas, which then became itself part of Western civilization, and other continents, which with the exception of Australia did not, but which had their own local and indigenous traditions, went on along for a long time, and all of the famous sacred cows of the 18th and 19th century allowed this process to go on because they replaced the need of the Europeans at that time to satisfy the very honest and profound elements which existed in the human soul, moral integrity and so forth and so on, but such theses as evolution, a la Darwin, which is really a big joke, or white man's burden, survival of the fittest, the idea of civilization with a capital C, and so forth and so on, the Hegelian philosophy of history. These were all elements which seem to make this whole process a very natural process. And there are still many people on the surface of the earth that think that this is the natural process. That is, India or Persia or China, they must follow this. There's one part of the world for which this is an ideology, and if you don't believe in this, you get shot along the wall, and that is the Marxist communist world. But for the other world, even if there's not a totalitarian ideology, nevertheless, many people believe in this. Many people believe that there is only one way to follow, which leads to, as I said, to civilization with a capital C, and you will still talk about whether certain people are civilized or not, which means do they know how to use two forks if you put it before them on a table, or just one fork or no forks at all. This is the survival of a kind of worldview which was very powerful just 100 years ago, even just 50 years ago. The two devastating wars, the First and Second World War, that really shook completely the foundations of many people in such isms. But while these isms went on, no one ever thought that the path that was followed by Western civilization was ever going to have any difficulties. As when Spengler wrote his Decline of the West, he was really laughed at as being completely out of his mind. René Guénon, one of the greatest figures that the West has produced during this century or during any century, one of the greatest metaphysicians that the West has ever produced, when he wrote his book, The Crisis of the Modern World, in 1927, as late as 1927, a book which has gone into 30 editions in France since then, in which he predicted, among many things, the downfall of China going communist, and many other things, many remarkable things. When he wrote his book in 1927, it didn't make a ripple. No one ever took it seriously. No one ever read it. And it took a long time for people, the few people in the West, who realized suddenly that this road will lead to a dead end, to have their voice heard. And suddenly it was actually with the ecological crisis becoming an external reality that certain people were forced to really rethink the situation. And in this case, I think there are two important facts which are very telling. First of all, of course, the invention of a bomb that can put into doubt the future of man. That is philosophically and theologically very meaningful, because in the old days, by the old days I mean just a century ago, I don't mean the Middle Ages, there were two types of human beings. Those who believed that history had an end, but that end was in the hands of God. The people in the first century of the Christian era who felt that the apocalyptic events were coming very soon. They're also in Islam. After the first generation of the Prophet of Islam, people thought that the world was going to come to an end, because the perfection brought on earth by Prophet, by great manifestation of the truth, is such that anything after this is a very great contrast. And people who have experienced that perfection feel that the world is finished because you can no longer duplicate that perfection. So this is a phenomenon you see in every religion. So there were people even in the old days who felt that the end of history was near. But this end was always, as I said, in the hands of God. And therefore it was always combined with hope. With a kind of hope and serenity and happiness which is hardly conceivable for the vast majority of people today. Because they understood that an end which has to do with God is not an external destruction. It's an inner reintegration unto a spiritual principle. And therefore something of great beauty. And that is why what is called the apokatastasis in Christian theology, which is the final integration of all things unto God, is really an event which crowns the whole history of the universe in a positive sense. Anyway, one group were this, and the other group was this, and the other group didn't believe this at all, but they believed that mankind had a very, very long history ahead, that there was progress to be made, and the Superman a la Nietzsche, and these people were going to be established on the surface of the earth, and things were going to evolve. And anyway, it were the people that put the infinity in the finite, here in the sense of time rather than of space. Eternity had been transferred into a long future ahead, and paradise was somewhere there after a few 5-year plans or the revolution of the proletariat or something like that, but we were going to get to that paradise. Now there was not this third group of human beings for whom there was hope neither in the one nor the other. And it's this which occurred for the first time really in our own generation. By our, I mean those who are as old as I am, in their early 40s, who at least were young children when the first experience of the atomic bomb and later on the hydrogen bomb suddenly broke upon their consciousness, and they realized that they may be a generation without a future. But not in the sense of the apostles or the disciples of Christ who also felt they were the last generation, because that did have a future. They were people who lived in the world of faith and for whom death, in fact, was the gate to the eternal life, and that's why so many of them were eaten so easily by the lions and they didn't recant. It was very different from the type of world that we have. And I think this was one important event, very, very important event. The idea of the loss of hope. And in fact, the reaction of modern man to this situation is one of the best proofs that how right St. Augustine was when he said that man cannot live without hope. That hope is a theological virtue, and that is part of the human state. So this idea of turning back upon oneself, upon the world, upon asking the whole civilization, this was one element. And the other element is of a less philosophical or more immediate nature, that is the constriction brought upon the way of living through the very way that people live. That is, this is what is called the whole environmental crisis. That gradually people began to see that the air is dirty, that their eyes get tired, and they're becoming psychologically very depressed, and so forth and so on, and they're having more and more difficult time in the big cities. And this did not change really arithmetically, but geometrically, asymptotically, went up asymptotically. And a city like New York, for example, the decay of the natural environment from 1800 to 1950 is not just straight like that. It went like that. And it was during a period of 20 or 30 years, especially in this country, which has produced the most devastating and powerful technology of any civilization in the world, when the first sense of the crisis was felt. It is, I think, extremely significant that today the Americans are the most concerned with the ecological crisis, then the Northern Europeans, then the Southern Europeans. And this is in exact proportion to the development of technology in these countries. I mean, if you're sitting in a nice little village near Salamanca in Spain, you really don't think very much of the ecological crisis. But if you happen to be here trying to drink the water of the Hudson River, you think twice, obviously. So this is, of course, related precisely to the power that man had in remolding his environment. Hence, the ecological crisis, which, along with that very profound psychological transformation, which in Europe, which from this cultural point of view, not the ecological point of view, became aware before America of these things, caused the very book, La Crise du Monde Moderne of Guénon, to become a bestseller after being neglected for 20 years. These two factors brought upon a situation in which for the first time in 400, 500 years, as has been mentioned by Professor Thompson in one of his works, or for the first time, Western man has begun to question fundamentally what he's doing, which comes back to the fundamental question, who am I? That is to question the nature of man. Because once you question the nature of the cosmos, you come back to question yourself. And once you question the nature of God, you again come back to question yourself, because you're always questioning your relation with something. You do not question the nature of God, you question the nature of your understanding of the nature of God, really. And therefore, the question of who am I, and this whole lifestyle, the way of living and the way of seeing the world, which issues from one's conception of oneself, has therefore been cast into doubt, and very wisely so. But this casting into doubt of the fundamental question of who am I, that is the answer that man had given to himself for a long time, has brought with it, of course, a very painful process, because it is like going to a dentist with a bad toothache and having him empty your tooth. If he doesn't fill it, and you just come out of the office with a tooth that has been emptied, it hurts much more than before you even went to the dentist. So, of course, there are a lot of people who today have undergone that first process, and now they're looking for the correct refill so that the tooth will not hurt again, and that is very, very difficult to come by, especially in a world in which financial and commercial interests are such that they even influence sometimes people who claim spiritual authority, which is really the greatest tragedy of all, to sell God along with worldly things. But it has created a situation in which there's a great deal on the market, but most of which should be banned by the Pure Food and Drug Act of the spiritual world. But since there is no act like that, it just goes on its own. Because we always write legislation for physical poisons, but never for the non-physical poisons. We think all kinds of poisons should have a chance to expand, because that is not real for us. In societies in which men and women were banned from doing certain things, it's because the spirit was a reality. And the same way that in the United States you have a Sweetex that comes to the market 1 month, and the next month it's off the market because they say it's not good for you. It's because the body is considered to be a real thing. But since, unfortunately, the psyche and the spirit, they do not have that concrete reality, it is considered to be the plane of freedom, and don't do anything and don't say anything, let everybody do what he wills. But unfortunately, the effect that certain things can have on the psyche are much, much more devastating than the cancer of the stomach that one might get from the wrong kind of sweetener. Anyway, in this situation in which many people are asking fundamental questions, and in which there's a kind of process of dissolution and recrystallization and coagulation in the alchemical sense, where certain things are molded again into a primary substance from which one hopes a new reality will be recrystallized. In this situation, one of the most remarkable things is that very, very few people talk about what it takes to solve the ecological crisis. Everybody talks now about the ecological crisis, even people who want to become candidates for the Senate or for the governorship of a state or even the president in this country. It's the only country in the world which it's a very good sign. At least they have to say something about this, although they never act later on, but at least they say something about it. They know that the public is interested. You've passed the Pure Water Act. It's one of the very few instances in American history in which an act has been passed 72 to nothing in the Senate and nothing has been done about it afterwards. Really quite remarkable. But at least some people are saying something about it, but no one is saying something about this point, which is really fundamental. And it's with this that I want to really to bring the discussion to an end. And that is, what must be done to overcome this imbalance between man and nature? Most people think you have to use more technology in a wise way in order to solve the problem. All you have to do is to fine some company $30 million, like was done the other day, not to throw chemicals into some river, and they won't throw chemicals anymore. But no one is willing really to pay the price that must be paid in order to live at peace with nature. And the price is really death and rebirth. It is a transformation which is very profound. It is another way of looking at the world. And that is a very difficult thing to do. And that is why when you really come down to brass tacks, when so many people who speak about limits to growth, as Mr. Pache himself has done, says we must turn now from quantitative growth to qualitative growth. That sounds fine. But how do we turn to qualitative growth? By turning the needs of the human being from material things to non-material things. This is where you come upon the most abominable ignorance of what the human being is like. Because it is an ignorance of the power of the human passions, of the power and the pull which externalization has upon the human soul. It is very easy to externalize, extremely difficult to internalize. You will sit 3 hours in a movie house if it's a good movie that attracts you, or with a friend talking, or walking down a street and watching the shops. But if you have to force yourself for 30 seconds to think about nothing, you find it's extremely difficult. And that is why you have such a qualitative experience of time. In times when we can externalize ourselves, we don't have to think about ourselves, about our innerness, time passes by very rapidly. But if we don't, and we have to turn upon ourselves, it goes very slowly. And the more the modern civilization spreads over the earth, the more it is true. A Persian or an Indian peasant in a little village can sit for 3 hours by the side of the road like that waiting for a bus. Because the inside is not so emptied, it can do with itself. But you take a citizen of a big city, modernized or so-called educated person, he has to have a transistor radio, the Time magazine, a book, chewing gum, pipes, about 7 or 8 things to be able to keep this darn psyche from making him go mad, to be able to occupy himself. He just can't wait 3 hours. And that has a lot to do with our inner emptiness. The more empty one becomes inwardly, the more is he or she satisfied only by that which is external. And therefore, the simple statement of Mr. Pache and others that all you have to do to change quantitative growth into qualitative growth means that essentially you have to create a sense of interiority, a sense of inwardness within man. Man, of course, also means women. I hope in a place such as Lindisfarne you do not have to repeat this. The so-called revolt of the female element against the male element in the society is a very, very telling and profound thing. It's only after man stops being man that the woman stops being a woman. And once if I come here again, I'll be very glad to speak to you about the metaphysical significance of this. But that's not for us today to discuss. Let me come back to what I was saying. There is within the human being today the need for this interiority, for this inwardness. And it is only this, coupled with a total knowledge of the universe, which we call sacred knowledge, which sounds very funny in English. Let's just keep the Latin scientia sacra, the kind of knowledge which is not divorced from the sacred. And these together, which alone can give man the possibility of regaining the right to live within the world and in peace with the world. You might say that from a religious point of view, the ecological crisis is the beginning, or was, beginning of the punishment which man receives from God for trying to live without God in a world which really belongs to God and not to man, and in which man is really a traveler and a custodian rather than the owner. And this usurpation of a right which he never had, in a sense, comes back upon man in the form of receiving all the constrictions and also the tragedy of war and external war and internal war which he faces. The question of living at peace but in disequilibrium with oneself is not a possibility that exists. It's really no more than a dream, no more than the worst kind of chimera and most kind of illusion, which many people think can be done. That is, you can preserve the characteristics of modern civilization as a civilization which is based on the negation of the totality of the divine principle and its application to all of life. That is, to have a kind of part of the universe where God's law doesn't apply. That's what I call extraterritoriality, which many people think is possible, but it's not. There's no place where God's laws do not apply. It's like creating a part on the earth where there's no law of gravity. You can't do it. Even if you have a little laboratory, it applies in one way or another. This impossibility has to be realized. And the only way that this can be done is by the re-establishment of an inner equilibrium, which will then establish the external equilibrium quite automatically. And this, again, cannot be done with really the rediscovery of tradition, in the sense that I use it. I don't mean historical customs. I mean the divine revelation and all of its historical deployment. Otherwise, everything else is scanty, peripheral, and segmented. For example, all of these wonderful sciences of antiquity, you can take them one by one. Let's say the late Hans Kaiser rediscovered the sciences of harmony. And I'm so glad his book Acrosis has now been translated from German into English. It's a capital work, a very, very important work. And a great deal of the Pythagorean science and wisdom, which was lost, has now been rediscovered, first through Pantemos, and then Hans Kaiser and Levi, other people. Well, thank God for that. It's a very, very important thing. And perhaps the cosmological sciences of Islamic civilization, of Hinduism, will become known. Western Hermeticism is now receiving a very careful study, especially in Italy and France, where you have had remnants of the survival of it anyway, and now you have this new series that's just coming out in France starting this year, in which major works of Hermetic science are being published. These things are wonderful, and I think they're totally necessary. But these are not going to transform the soul of Western man. They will transform the being of a certain number of individuals. There's no doubt about it. But what must happen more than that is the rediscovery of the totality of tradition. It's my hope that the study that is being made today in the West of the various Oriental traditions, whether it be Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, Shinto, shamanic, whatever it is, will not only help the very few people, because I think that will only be very few, who really are destined to follow these traditions themselves inwardly, but to help to revive in the West this kind of forgotten knowledge, which in fact is the title of the recent book of Houston Smith, which just came out a few days ago, which I think is a very apt title, Forgotten Knowledge. That is this total knowledge of a tradition which the West certainly possessed, which I was just talking to Dr. Thompson. It seems to be one of the aims of this community, that is the rediscovery of the totality of the Christian tradition, including its mystical in the original sense and esoteric dimensions. It's only that which can bestow upon the total life of man once again the sense of the sacred, and re-establish that harmony between man and nature, which even within the Christian tradition, which did not emphasize it so much in the medieval period, is certainly present. And all one has to do is to bring it back to life, and in this sense the sort of metaphysics of nature contained especially in the Japanese application of Buddhism and in Islam, in these two traditions, because Taoism is not so easily accessible today, those two living traditions. These can help, of course, in bringing back these ideas to the West. But ultimately it will not be ideas alone, which you read in books, which can bring about the great transformation. It is, of course, the sacred itself, the reality of the sacred. And in this period in which many things are tried, I think the greatest danger that is present is a kind of superficial satisfaction with a passing and transient contact with the sacred, in which one mistakes the smell of the steak with the eating of it, if I can put it in this way. Because it is too easy to go into a beautiful ashram in India, where you have birds chirping away and it's quiet and you don't have any Fifth Avenue buses changing gears, and the very peace in the atmosphere thinks that you've really become a Jivan Mukti and delivered from all limitation, and you're in a state of samadhi. But coming back to London and New York, this wears off after a few weeks, and you're left only with the headache of the flight back from Delhi. And then worse than that, of course, is that you don't go to Delhi or other places at all, and you just wait here for these grand tours of yogis and all kinds of masters to come around and enlighten you and go back into the next performance, like the opening of the Met every fall. I do not want to be really facetious only, but I think that this is a very, very serious matter. To speak about the sacred brings with it a great responsibility. And in all traditions, something is said of this. You either do not play with the sacred fire, or if you do and you're not prepared, you get burned by it. And because at the antipode of it, at the other side, is the loosening of tremendous forces. Forces which are real, but which are not necessarily positive. And once you're in a prison, you oftentimes think, well, let me get out of here, I'll be very happy to get out. But I'm sure by that I mean getting out where you have fresh air, not into the sewer. You might be digging into the sewer with the hope of making escape. But if you get stuck in the sewer the rest of your life, you would much prefer to remain in the cell to start with. Now, there are worlds below and worlds above. When there are cracks in the materialistic world, the cracks from below and cracks from above. And many people cannot distinguish the difference between the two. And the great danger that exists in the West today is that anything non-material is taken to be spiritual, which is of course nonsense. There's a very great difference between the spiritual and the psychological. And in the psychic world, between the positive psychic forces and the negative psychic forces. And there are too many powers within the human being for a very long time untouched and untested in the West, that it makes it very easy to present these things as kind of openings into a new world. For example, discovering the importance of the sole of your feet. All you have to do is to massage the sole of your feet and you feel in ecstasy. And so there's a whole school for the massaging of the soles of feet. Or much more profound than that, the rediscovery of the rest of the body, of sexuality, of all kinds of things, of meditation, so-called meditation, that is, you just close your eyes and don't think. Of course, once you do that, you gain tremendous powers for a while. But what guarantee do you have that you will be visited by the angels later on and not by the demons? What does meditation mean without the presence of a spiritual discipline of which this is an ancillary? This is really an application. So I think the great danger, once you realize the missing dimension of the most important crisis of our age, which is the so-called cosmological, what I call it as a metaphysical, and anyway the sacral dimension, and you realize something has to be done, then to come to a market in which you face this remarkable variety of sort of spiritual candy, you might say, very few of which ask of man the first condition of all authentic spiritual life, namely discipline. Discipline within a total order. Discipline which is meaningful, and which claim for their methods and systems something which is as closely related to the self-pride as modern man as anything can be. Namely, that if you happen to be a Tibetan or a Persian or an Indian who lived 300 years ago, you would have to spend 25 years meditating 5 hours a day, living very meekly, practicing all the virtues to be able to understand one line of Ibn Arabi or the Bhagavad Gita. But now all you have to do is to spend $1.25 in a store and pay a few dollars for a few meditation sessions, and there you do it. I mean, how can God be so unjust? Why is it that a part of humanity should have all the bread, all the electricity, all the hospitals, everything else, and at the same time a kind of inner road to quick spirituality? This is absurd. This is totally absurd. That is not what the reality of the situation is. There are compensations. God is merciful, and He never expects of human beings more than they can give. That is certainly so. But He certainly does expect of human beings what they can give. And therefore, my advice to a group such as this, which is performing a very important task, and it's very significant that groups such as this have been formed, is to realize that they're working within a forest in which there are all kinds of dangers lurking behind every tree. It is not a forest that has yet become transformed into the paradise under the tree in which the Buddha received his illumination. It is a forest in the sense that you have in your folk tales, in which there is, as I said, a fierce force animal behind every tree. And it's not an innocent ambiance in which all the negative forces in the world, which in fact have brought man to this impasse, will now sit by the side, putting one leg on top of the other, and just observe the few people who are trying to do something, to do what they like. They say in all traditional theologies that nothing makes the devil more unhappy than to realize that a person is fleeing from him. And you have this most beautiful story in the Divine Comedy of Dante, with which I shall end. Dante accounts that there was a person, Italian, was a prince and who had led a very lewd and loose life, who had broken all the moral codes. And the devil felt that quite naturally he was his. But at the moment of death, he was fighting a battle along at the edge of the river. And when he was wounded and was about to die, when he fell in, he mentioned the name of the Virgin Mary, said, "Oh Maria, save me." And when the devil came, the body had gone and the river had washed it away. There's a very, very beautiful story in which Dante tries to show that the sacred can always save man, yes, but the devil sits there and waiting for those who are not going to do anything to combat the terrible forces, which today we do not understand as the devil, but which in other days were called as such, which today appear to us as dead ends, as paths that we follow that do not get anywhere, a labyrinth which one enters and never leaves, techniques and methods which just snarl one up psychologically, which destroy one's inner energies rather than making one, and so forth and so on, which remove man's inner nature from the ability to act and act correctly, all these things. And therefore, by whatever name we call it, we must be aware that we are living in a world, I think, in which there are possibilities, very great positive possibilities, but at the same time in which there are many dangers. I therefore only hope and pray that your organization will be able to do what it must and at least keep in this West, so much in quest of the truth, the small flame of the truth alive. That's all, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. Well, I would like to start off with a question. I think those of us here who are working to put knowledge back into a sense of the metaphysical roots of knowledge and the sense of the infinite, and linking that with the discipline of a contemplative path, are aware of the dangers of the ESTs and Scientologies and Rikas and the various kinds of things you were alluding, and are sort of able to try to keep those demons outside the gates and not allow them in. But one of the curious things as a historian that I wonder about when, in your earlier remarks, when you look around the world and you see Islamic science, Taoist science, say with Needham studies, your studies, ancient Maya science, the Mexican was an incredible civilization. Why was it that this peculiar aberration that displaced even the Western Gnostic and esoteric traditions was so powerful and so charismatic, so that even now we find, say, the worst of my tradition in America is relating to, in a sense, the worst of the Mideast in your tradition, and we find that rather than the great parts of our traditions coming together, we're getting this sense that Tehran is going the way of I grew up in Los Angeles, so Tehran's going the way of Los Angeles, and it's the charisma of materialism that seems to have dominated the entire planet. One thing that I do find hope in your presence here is remembering that when we first sent our crusaders into the Middle East with this kind of vulgar materialism and primitive armies, the response of it was the anatodromia by which Islamic science filtered back into Europe and created the Renaissance. So that I hope now that America is selling $50 billion worth of armaments, that your presence here as a scholar is perhaps more significant than McDonnell Douglas aircraft in Iran. But nevertheless, we do have this problem of the relationship of our two countries now seems to be not the best of our traditions. And how can we as scholars, do something about this?
This is a very profound and very complicated question to answer. What happened actually, as far as the relationship between the Western world and various Asian countries were concerned, was not an immediate attraction to the charisma of materialism. Don't forget that the Portuguese captured the Persian Gulf in the 16th century. That is before the rise of one of the most brilliant periods of the traditional culture of Persia during the Safavid period, the time when the Shah Mosque and other great masterpieces of architecture were built, when some of the greatest philosophy was written, and so forth and so on. Asia, for several centuries, resisted, in fact, the civilization which was vastly superior to it both materially and militarily. And it is only after a long time that finally it gave up, it succumbed. And the great tragedy was that it began to succumb at the very moment when this civilization began to crumble from within itself. In every other case in human history, if you look at least in the written history that we can study, you used to have two types of situations. Either one nation, one country, one civilization would invade the other. It would be both materially, militarily essentially, and spiritually and culturally more powerful. In which case it would bring with it both physical dominance and also will bring with it a new worldview. The best example of this, let's say, being the invasion of Persia by the Arabs. Of course, Persia was a vast empire, but they had become weak spiritually, and only 20 years after the Persians defeated the Byzantines and came all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, only 20 years later, they were defeated by the Arab armies, which really is a remarkable lesson of history. In 20 years, nobody would believe this, but it was an empire which, very powerful externally, was inwardly just crumbling, and so the Arabs came. They were both more powerful militarily, for whatever reason we will not enter into it, but also they brought with them a new spiritual message, which therefore the Persians were defeated in a sense in two ways for 2 centuries. They were occupied militarily, and they were also occupied, if I can call it, religiously. But the religious occupation brought with it a new spirituality, a new wave of life, and suddenly from this came one of the golden periods of Persian culture. And the other possibility is when a civilization or a country or a people dominate over another, and they're more powerful militarily and materially, but they are weaker spiritually, and they're receptive, and so they gradually become absorbed. And both India and Persia have had many instances of that, the most outstanding being the Mongol invasion. The Mongols invaded Persia and brought about the greatest destruction that any civilization has seen in the history of mankind materially, according to all historians. I mean, nothing that what Attila did to Rome compares to what they did, because it was a much vaster region. It destroyed the irrigation system, the very foundations of physical life in many parts of Persia. But the grandson of Hulaku was already Sultan Muhammad Khudabande, a very devout Muslim king who built what is perhaps the greatest masterpiece of Islamic architecture, the Sultaniya, near Zanjan. So these people became completely absorbed, and these so-called ruthless and barbaric Mongols, they were not that barbaric as people think, but they appeared to civilize Western Asia. They were at the same time receptive, and they brought with them new art motives. They caused indirectly the revival of Persian art, and these remarkable Ilkhanid and Safavid miniatures would have been impossible without them. That's why it's a great enigma to all Western historians. How can you have 30 years after the devastation of Persia materially, the rise of the greatest school of miniature that the Persians have ever produced? How can this be explained? But the coming of the West to Asia was a third case, which had never happened before. A civilization which was both materially and militarily more powerful, but not spiritually more powerful, but nevertheless like concrete, completely unreceptive. That is, which was not absorbed, but which at the same time could not give a new spirituality. I mean, they tried with Christianity, but only the Philippines became Christian. It's the only Christian country in all of Asia. Well, the Lebanon was half and half before these tragedies occurred. But they could not make India Christian or China Christian or Islamic world Christian. And so its own Christianity was becoming more and more weak. It was itself on the defensive vis-a-vis rationalism and all kinds of other isms in Western Europe, and therefore it could not provide a new spiritual force. Hence, you had this incredibly cruel and tragic situation, which had never occurred before, in which these civilizations, comprised of human beings who usually have respect for power. Man respects power, unfortunately. Whatever civilization is, traditional or non-traditional, there's a very profound unity of human nature. It's the cultures that remold this nature. But down deep there are many elements. The element of fear, hope, death, and so forth and so on. Love exists in all civilizations. It's in the nature of man to respect power. Resisted because of their strong traditional culture for several centuries, not decades. For several centuries, what you call this charisma of materialism. They kept bleeding and bleeding in a materialistic sense. They kept losing their wealth, all their income, all their inner freedom, and of course their only religious laws and customs were in many, many places, especially where the French and the Portuguese came in, or the Dutch came in. The English tried to keep the customs and rule through the customs. Even they were molested, as in Indonesia, what happened in Java, what happened in Algeria, The Arabic language was banned. The Arabs couldn't speak Arabic anymore, and this kind of thing. And they resisted for 300 years. It's not a short period. It's longer than the whole history of this nation. Until finally, this resistance began to weaken. That is, purely human and profane aspects of human nature gradually began in these parts of the world to try to assert itself. And worse than that, people who began to say, look, if we don't get as powerful as the Westerners, our own religion is going to be destroyed. And the first generation of people who began to westernize, they were trying to westernize in order to save their own nation. And it just went on step by step until you get to a situation like now, when you have the Soviet Union with a population of 230 million people and an army of God knows how many million and how many thousand tanks along our northern border, with a great desire to come to the Indian Ocean and to get its hands on all the goodies which you invented how to use, that is the oil in the Persian Gulf, up in the north, and another world power here on this side, Western Europe there, and there is no government in any part of Asia who can say, all right, now we will not preserve our independence. We've had oftentimes these debates on the highest level. If, for example, we don't have arms and we get taken over one day, as we were 30 years ago in the Second World War, by the Russian and the American and the British armies, what guarantee do we have, even the little freedom we have now to practice our religion, to build our own mosques and so forth and so on, will continue? So everybody, even for the sake of preserving the nation, tries to emulate the West. And the emulation of the West means the destruction of those very things for which we're trying to preserve. So you have this terribly contradictory situation. A great tragedy which shows precisely that is a kind of crisis on the cosmic level, really. That is not a local problem. The problem of the West is not a local problem. Every man now on the surface of the earth is being put before the supreme temptation, having to choose between the God and the wild blue sea, or the devil and the wild blue sea, if I can change the proverb. And he has to choose between two things. And the theological significance of this is that now all people have to test this temptation. In the sense that before 1951, a Tibetan lived within a totally traditional world. There was very little possibility for him to even rebel against it. He was saved for the sacred by the tradition. There was a net kind of below. There's certain great evils you were prevented from doing. You could not disperse yourself more than a certain extent. Of course, whether you became a great lama or just an ordinary citizen, yes, there were all kinds of levels. But there was a level below which you could not fall, you might say, from a religious point of view. Now, he had to be tested. The whole earth, in a sense, had to go through this crucible once, and be tested once. And this is a theological, you might say, reason, metaphysical reason. But when you come to the level of action, the only possibility, the only solution is if America stops making new types of planes, and so does Russia. Do not make a MiG-24 instead of 23, and not an F-15 or 14, whatever they are, I don't know what these numbers are. The moment there are people sitting down and doing these, and one number can mean the total reversal of everything, absolutely, and a country like the Lebanon can be just cut in half and divided, and it's happened so many times in Asia in the last 30 years. A Buddhist monk sitting down and just eating their breakfast in Southeast Asia, suddenly everything is reversed and they're shot along the wall, and everybody knows what has happened. As long as this is true, the countries which are on the receiving end have no choice, especially those which are near the mouth of the line. I mean, if you're the Senegal on the Atlantic, you have certain advantages. But countries like Turkey, like Iran, have no choice. And a country like India, of course, has the great benefit of its own weight. It's too big for anyone to swallow, and in fact, no one wants to swallow it because there's such poverty and so much difficulty. Nobody wants to do anything with it. But other countries have this terrible problem. Same for West Germany. Once you have this polarization of power, and neither side is willing to change its lifestyle, you just cannot tell the rest of the people of Asia, all right, now you just stay put here for 200 years, wait until we solve our problems. On the practical level, that is an impossibility. So the great hope is that this kind of transformation will come about within a country such as yours. Here you see in a country such as America, if one scientist, let's say, says that religion is a good thing, although he may be a really a third grader as far as philosophy is concerned. He might know nothing. But because he is this, has this aura around him, his words have more effect at the University of Lucknow and Tehran than what all of the pundits and religious scholars of India or Iran will have to say. This happens to be the situation in the world today. I mean, look at your playwrights. Whatever they write is sooner or later on put on stages in Tehran, in Beirut, in Cairo, and so forth and so on. And if somehow the religious life is reasserted here, it can have the greatest effect back home. And so, in a sense, we are in this together. I've said oftentimes, although Guénon wrote L'Orient et l'Occident 50 years ago, during these 50 years, the important thing that has changed is that, in a sense, the Orient and the Occident are two poles now which every human being carries within himself. They're no longer just geographical locations. We all have our Orient and we all have our Occident. And we are, as I said, the whole world is in this together. And in this sense, I would agree with your idea of planetary culture in no other sense, because I think God has destined the earth to be several humanities. And each humanity was, in all normal times, humanity as such. And an Indian never had to worry what reasons Saint Bernard was giving for the proof of the Trinity, and the other way around. If you were living here even 100 years ago in New York, you didn't have to bother about Sufism. But today, we're all brought together, and I think all the spiritual forces of the world have to come together to solve this problem. And I think what the East can do for the West is to be able to give back to the West this lost knowledge. But the way it's being done right now is almost like what you're doing to us. That is, keep changing one of the push buttons in a plane and selling it for another $20 million, and then crying in the news stories, these terrible people are buying these planes. Of course, if we don't buy them, we'll have our arm twisted like this, but I only read in the New York Times what is written on the first page. And Asia is doing the other way around. That's what really makes me very sad. And there are very few people who, without any sense of personal gain or love for their name or ambition for worldly things, are really trying to fulfill this task. And it's not such an easy thing, but I think a good beginning has been made. Much better than what many people think, and today is the day, I think, to have the courage to criticize. And once you have a place like Esalen, places like that, established, a lot of money is spent, people come and go, the one thing that is missing is that nobody is willing to say what is the truth and what is falsehood. And once there is no truth, there is no religion, obviously. And once there is truth, there is also untruth. I mean, once you accept that 2 and 2 is 4, then 2 and 2 cannot be 5. And since this is considered to be dogmatism, on the spiritual plane, all is fair play, because there's no criteria for the truth. And of course, you cannot establish this truth on any level than the highest level, which would incorporate every form of partial truth, which in fact I think has already been done by Guénon, Schwann, and people like that. They've provided the metaphysical tool necessary to grasp the truth in the highest sense. But when we come to apply it, I know everyone is quite reticent to say anything or do anything. This new psychology they're trying to develop out in California pulls from the bosom of traditional psychotherapy, which I think is the only valid form of psychology. Every psychoanalyst is a counterfeit of a spiritual master. Really, he's trying to do what a spiritual master alone can do without having the power to do it. So he just swims on the surface and you have all your complexes removed like a potato. But there are certain complexes in man which should be there. The tension between heaven and earth. Tension between what we can be and what we are not. And once those are removed, we become a plant. Of course, even plants have that, dead plants, because plants also grow towards the sun. So this sort of thing, somebody has to come and say, all right, now what are we doing? I mean, what is authentic and what is not? And this archaeological excavation of all remains of all traditions, dead and alive, and putting them all together in gallery 1, gallery 2, gallery 3, like we do in our art museums, I don't think at all will do any great service, especially the next generation that is going to come. I mean, the younger people who are going to be faced with more and more multiplicity, more and more choices, you might say. People 30 years ago in England and France looking for spirituality, well, there was Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and that was about it. Now you have all kinds of archaic cults and things like that resuscitated, of course, in an artificial sense. and you're pulling out all kinds of plants from every kind of museum and stuffing it into this plant house. And I think it's going to be a difficult choice unless people are brave enough to face to it today, to not mistaken truth and charity. I think the greatest charity to the world is to express the truth. That is why this is such a rare virtue. There's so too few people to do it, and it's considered to be arrogance, which of course it is not.